Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where the only thing more stimulating than our stories is the sleep that you will get from them. Tonight we are answering a question that has plagued mankind since the dawn of time. In fact, it was disgusting. Ancient Rome had no effective sewage system, and even worse, no real garbage disposal system either. Instead, people would just throw their waste out the window into the streets below, where it would accumulate into disgusting piles. Dogs were often chained up outside people's homes, and they would bark incessantly through the night. Not to mention the street vendors who made their homes out of carts and would also sleep with their animals. Just walking down the street, you could easily be stabbed, beaten, robbed, or even run over by a chariot. Chariots, by the way, were one of the biggest killers in Rome, whether you were driving them or walking among them. As mentioned, they rumbled along the roads at unpredictable times of the day and with little to no warning. These were a series of underground dungeons located underneath the Roman Forum. Trials in ancient Rome were notoriously unfair. You could be tried for any number of reasons, as mentioned, but don't expect these men to be impartial. Roman jurors were only paid half a cestus for their service, which amounted to less than $1 per day. In addition to this, the case of the prosecution was usually much stronger than that of the defense. Crucified people were often left to die slowly from dehydration or starvation. Another punishment was the death by wild beasts. This involved being sewn up in a leather sack, along with a number of wild animals. The sack would then be thrown into the audience at the gladiatorial games and ripped open. From here, the animals would attack the condemned and tear them apart. Prosecutors would use every tactic at their disposal to win cases, including paying off witnesses to testify falsely, threatening potential witnesses to stay away, and appealing to the prejudices of the crowd. Between the disease, the violence, the poverty, and the insane emperors, it was a daily struggle just to stay alive. So count yourself lucky you never had to live in ancient Rome. Thanks for watching. You see, the Roman emperors were power-hungry, paranoid men who ruled through fear and oppression. They were constantly worried about being overthrown, and so did everything they could to ensure their power, including killing anyone that they suspected of wanting to usurp them. A round-trip ticket from Rome to Athens cost the equivalent of about $47, while a round-trip ticket to Asia Minor cost the equivalent of about $95. Unfortunately, for many Romans, traveling was not an option, and so they were stuck in the empire and at the mercy of its leaders. The presiding judge would also often jump at the chance to end a trial quickly. He also hosted feasts, inviting 8 men of a certain age range and appearance. After they ate, he would have them killed. Caligula invited 8 men of a certain height and build to dinner, and after they ate, he had them For example, Marcus Aurelius famously unleashed his rage on a group of senators who laughed during a gladiatorial combat. Apparently, he felt that such behavior was unbecoming of a Roman, and so had them thrown into the Tiber River and drowned. Another time, he banished a poet from Rome because he recited a couplet that he found offensive. Nero enjoyed throwing lavish feasts, inviting 8 young men of only one type, bald, short, or fat. After they ate, he had them killed. This meant that you could be rushed through your defense and given little chance to call witnesses or gather evidence, and your trial would take place in the Forum, the center of Roman life. For minor crimes like stealing food or breaking someone's property, you might be sentenced to the galleys as punishment. This was especially common for slaves, who could be punished in this way for no reason at all. At the galleys, you would be chained to an oar and forced to row a ship either for days or weeks on end. The worst part was that you would be whipped if you didn't row hard enough, and you would be whipped if you stopped to rest. Also, the other rowers would make your life miserable by throwing salt in your eyes, sticking feces in your mouth, and beating you up. Here, surrounded by thousands of people, you would be tried before a judge, but don't expect much fairness from them. Judges were known to accept bribes, to turn a blind eye to evidence, and to demand certain outcomes from juries. Prisoners would be held here until their trial and often wouldn't see daylight for weeks or months. Food was thrown to prisoners haphazardly, often rotting and infested with maggots. Slaves were also commonly imprisoned here and would often be forced to eat the scraps of their masters. It was also common for prisoners to be tortured in the pits before their trial, which meant that their wounds would become infected and fester, leading to gangrene and sometimes death. When you add to this the drunkenness of the average Roman, who frequently drove while drinking, and the fact that there were no traffic laws in the empire, you have a recipe for disaster. It was also incredibly common for families to keep pigs within their home itself, even if they didn't live in an apartment above a butcher shop. Not only were chariots fast, but they were large, too. A slave revolt against his master, accusations of witchcraft, disliking the emperor, having the wrong amount of gold in your pocket, failing to pay taxes, owing money to the wrong person, getting drunk and causing trouble, criticizing the emperor, having an affair with another married person. Basically, anything could get you thrown into the Roman pits. One of the most famous writers of the empire, Juvenal, wrote of the constant anxiety that everyone felt in Rome for fear of what could get them thrown into the pits. He wrote, "The whole life of Rome is uncertainty. Who will be next to fall? Who will be dragged by the next set of lictors into the depths of the Talianum? No man can tell." In fact, he added, a man may be ruined by his wife or son. There are fathers who would gladly die with their necks cut from ear to ear rather than hear the shrill screams of a daughter-in-law bargaining in the forum. They were pulled by teams of horses that could reach up to 4 strong and carried loads that reached up to 2 tons. To put this into perspective, the average Roman was around 5 feet tall and weighed 130 pounds. So imagine being hit by a 2-ton cart pulled by 4 horses. Not exactly an ideal scenario. Pigs were scavengers by nature, and so they would root around the house looking for food scraps and generally making a mess wherever they went. If you lived in an apartment above a shop, then you would often be privy to whatever goods they were selling and any human or animal waste that they threw out. And if you lived above a tavern, well, then you would have to deal with the sounds of drunken singing and fighting late into the night. Why wouldn't you last a day in the Roman Empire? Now, the first thing you need to know about ancient Rome is that it was very, very dirty. Citizens of Rome were also regularly exposed to raw sewage. Whenever the aqueducts that supplied the city with fresh water happened to burst, this was not uncommon because the aqueducts were built near the surface. And so when heavy carts passed over them, they would frequently break and dump raw sewage into the streets below. Bathing was also something that you would have to do with caution in ancient Rome. Citizens were typically too poor to have their own private bathroom. Instead, public bathhouses were used throughout the empire. These bathhouses were notoriously dirty places. For example, Emperor Nero banned women from using the public baths because they brought their slave men with them to clean their butt. And then those slave men would frequently abscond with their patrons' money and valuables. In addition to all this, the citizens of Rome shared their living spaces with rats, cats, dogs, and pigs everywhere. It wasn't just unsanitary conditions that would kill you in ancient Rome, though. In fact, your chances of dying from violence were high, too. If you were unlucky enough to be hit by a runaway chariot, you would have few options to escape the danger. You would also constantly be on edge in ancient Rome, knowing that at any second you could be thrown into the infamous Roman pits. But once you got to the pits, your problems would truly begin. Being in the Roman pits was a death sentence, but if you managed to survive, your troubles would far from be over. The jury itself was made up of local citizens, and they would decide your fate. The punishments in Rome were brutal and varied depending on your crime. Other punishments included exile from Rome altogether or crucifixion. This involved being nailed to a cross and left to die. So clearly, ancient Rome was a rough place to live. But now we come to the most dangerous aspect of Roman life: the emperors themselves. One emperor, Domitian, reportedly had a secret police force that infiltrated every level of society and reported back to him on anyone who spoke ill of him. To avoid being selected for these mysterious dinners, it was best to leave Rome. That is, if you could afford it. There were also plenty of opportunities for you to anger the emperor. Clearly, surviving in the Roman Empire was no easy feat.